Okay, now we are on to the regulatory roundtable. This is always a highlight of our FMQ conference. And I'm going to ask our panelists to come out. The panel is going to be moderated by one of our Georgetown alums, Mike Piwowar, former SEC Commissioner, Acting Chair. And Mike's panel includes Sandra, a great friend of the Psaros Center, Deputy Assistant Secretary for FSOC, Financial Stability Oversight Council of the Treasury Department, Commissioner Caroline Pham, a commissioner at the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And next to Mike Piwowar, we have Commissioner Mark Uyeda, a former student of mine, commissioner at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. So we have a terrific panel here and a terrific moderator. Thank you.
Wow, the bar's really high, so great. Thanks, Rena, and thanks to Mike and Rena for putting on a fantastic conference. I got a lot of notes from the earlier sessions that we'll piggyback off of, and a lot of the discussions earlier in some of the earlier sessions were dealing with some of the public policy choices that folks make. So I'm really excited that we have three distinguished people in the financial regulatory policy world here. We have two members of the financial market regulators that regulate all the financial markets, the securities markets, and the commodities markets. We heard a lot about them in the crypto sessions earlier today. And we're also pleased to have for the first time here Sandra from the U.S. Treasury Department. She's the lead staffer on something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and we'll hear from her briefly what that exactly is. Before I get started, all three of these, if you've ever been to one of these before or seen government officials, they all have to start with disclaimers. So why don't we just go down the line and get that out of the way?
Sure. Well, great to be here. My remarks today will be my views as an individual commissioner at the SEC and not necessarily the views of the full commission or my fellow commissioners.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, even though I went to GW Law, but that's okay.
We all make mistakes.
The views I state today are just those of my own in my individual capacity as a commissioner and do not necessarily represent that of the CFTC or of any other commissioner. As you can see, the CFTC and the SEC are still slightly different.
Good.
So thanks, Mike. It's great to be here as well. And I will also add that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and the views that I express here today might not necessarily reflect those of the Treasury or the FSOC.
All right, great. We'll get started with a few rounds of questions here, and we're going to leave some time at the end. Again, preference for students to ask questions, so students get ready to take your chance and ask the regulators whatever you want to ask them. So Commissioner Pham and Commissioner Uyeda, let me start with you. The theme of this conference is future of financial markets, innovation, and uncertainty. So let's start on the broad topic of innovation. Both of you, throughout your tenures, have stressed the need for regulation that does not stifle innovation. So Commissioner Pham, let me start with you. The CFTC's mission statement is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. How does innovation fit within this mission, and why have you continued to focus on this?
So that is the CFTC's mission statement on our website, but also one of our statutory mandates is that we are to promote responsible innovation and fair competition. So it's right there in the statute that this is one of our key purposes, and I think that's because the CFTC sits at the intersection of the real economy and the financial markets. We originally were created so that way farmers and agricultural producers and merchants would have a way to lay off the risks associated with growing and delivering, for example, grain crops that are sold in the grain market. So it's important that as business continues to evolve and as there are new products and new markets, that the CFTC has a regulatory framework that can accommodate that innovation in new products and new markets. And that can be because people decide that there is a new instrument that they would like to be able to hedge. So for example, interest rates. Or it can be because of technological advancements as we see in digital assets.
So, Commissioner Uyeda, the SEC's mission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, efficient markets, and promote capital formation. So how does innovation fit within the SEC's mission, and why is it so important to your work?
Well, the way I look at it is, why even have a financial market? And in my view, it is to promote economic growth, jobs creation, and innovation. And this is where finance meets those opportunities out there to provide capital to new risks, new opportunities. And that is in part, feeds into our mission. Yeah, part of it is about protecting investors, and we do that through a disclosure regime. And I think it's very important that we hew to that. Sometimes we get pressures to, well, maybe we can put a thumb on the scale in one area or the other area, but to me, it's ultimately about financial return. The whole reason we are not a merit regulator is because it's not up to the government to decide what ideas are great, what ideas are bad, how much risk should investors be taking. That's up to the investor. That's up to the financial professionals. I recall, I think shortly after I graduated Georgetown in the early 90s, someone thought, this idea of selling books through the internet, terrible idea. Books are heavy, shipping is costly. What a really bad idea. Things can happen. And what I view the markets, the capital markets, that allows that to happen. And then we as the regulator, we're looking at the bad actors. And that at least ought to be our principal focus. Those who lie, cheat, and steal. Because once you have the bad actors in the markets, that has the risk of tarring the entire market. With that adds, if not adding to the risk premium to the market, certainly it can even deter people from entering that market to begin with. So that's how I look at innovation and the SEC mission.
Great, thanks, Mark. So Sandra, let me turn to you. Before I ask you about innovation, we've heard a lot about the SEC, CFTC today. Folks in the room know pretty much about it, but we have this thing called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, aka FSOC. Could you just briefly explain what that is?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So for those of you who are not aware of the FSOC was established pursuant to Dodd-Frank in 2010, basically in the wake of the global financial crisis. And what Congress did was establish this council, and it has 10 voting members, 5 non-voting members, and it's chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, so Secretary Yellen, and it has representation from the markets regulators, the banking regulators. So we have, the Fed, the OCC, the FDIC, SEC, CFTC, CFPB. It's the panoply of regulators on the council. And the statutory mission of the FSOC is to identify, assess, and address potential threats to U.S. financial stability. And again, it's house the Treasury. I'm a Treasury staffer, and what we do is basically get principals and staff from all the agency together to just sort of bring the collective expertise around the table to think about risks in financial institutions, in financial markets, and sort of help connect the dots. So that's basically what the FSOC is. Would note that part of what the FSOC does, again, based on congressional mandate, is to produce a report every year on annual financial stability risks, which we've done since 2011. And part of our job, again, is to identify potential risks and put forth recommendations to address those risks.
Yeah, and I really like when you said connecting the dots, right? So before the FSOC was started, we had all the individual regulators, and they were all looking at their regulated entities in various ways, but risks can build up in the system-wide or systemic type of risk. So Congress's response to that was to create the FSOC, and you really have, your job, and we'll get into this a little more when we talk about risk and uncertainty, is to really look at those potential risks to the system on that. At the same time, recognizing that we need the innovation, and Secretary Yellen, the chair of the council, as you mentioned, used the same words that Commissioner Pham just used, responsible innovation in there. Can you talk about what is meant by responsible innovation?
Sure, happy to. Maybe just would start by noting, innovation is obviously a hallmark of, the U.S. financial system. And frankly, it's the theme of, I think, what makes this country great, whether it's technology or financial services, anyway, the great range of what this country does. And, I think, as you noted, Secretary Yellen has remarked on the importance of, again, what Commissioner Pham mentioned is responsible innovation. is to think about what opportunities that innovation can bring, all the benefits, so increased efficiency, greater access to knowledge, et cetera, but frankly also think about what are some of the maybe unintended consequences or potential repercussions of what innovation can bring. And it can't be one side or the other, in a silo. And so just, again, thinking about what the balance of those two things are is really important.
Yeah, so let's move on to uncertainty, and Sandra, I'm gonna stick with you on this, right? So the other theme of this conference is uncertainty, and you talked about how the statutory mission of the FSOC is about identifying risks. Economists, financial economists, tend to distinguish between risk and uncertainty, whereas risk are you kind of know what the possible scenarios are, you can assign some probabilities for those, and you can do some risk management technique. But really what the FSOC is dealing with is uncertainties. Like we don't even know what the possible things that are going to come. A global financial crisis, a pandemic, those types of things. How do you deal with uncertainty?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'd also say at the outset, I think for those who are in the financial stability field, our job is to worry. We're sort of paid to worry, which I think is what you want us to do. But that being said, there are, and I think, Mike, what you're getting is basically there are unknown unknowns, right? This is a term a lot of us are aware of. And of course, there are some known unknowns. And I would say that for the known unknowns, the council, again, works very hard to work together to connect the dots, to think about, like, what are the risks on the horizon that we could see or plausibly see. And again, those issues are identified in our annual report. For the unknown unknowns, again, it's really hard. You just don't know. And, so I would say two things on that front. One is the FSOC does work really hard to bring together expertise and insights to try to get a better sense of what's going on in financial markets and financial institutions so that we're better prepared when an unseen risk percolates. The second thing I would say is, when you think about financial stability, again, you can't plan for every possible shock or risk that may come up. So what we try to be thoughtful about, when thinking about financial stability is really honing in on the known vulnerabilities that we see in the financial system. So what are some of the structural weaknesses that we see? And our job is to think about how do we make those vulnerabilities less problematic? How do you make the financial system more resilient? So when those unknown, shocks occur, like a pandemic or whatever it is, geopolitical problem, the financial system is more resilient to guard against and mitigate those risks. And that's really our goal, Mike. That's basically how we characterize our mission.
So it's less about identifying what the specific risks are or uncertainties is coming up, and more about just making sure it's resilient for a number of things. Yeah.
And I would just maybe add to that. I think that the financial system plays such an important role, obviously. We're all focused on these topics here today, for the US economy and for everyday Americans. And you don't want a situation where the financial system is not resilient enough to play that important role, like what happened in 2008.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the underreported things that happened during the pandemic, one of the successes of FSOC and the regulators, was that if you think of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the banks were the problem. Fast forward to the pandemic, and Treasury and the FSOC the banks were much more safe and actually made them part of the solution, right? And so the Paycheck Protection Program and some of the other different facilities that were out there were actually run through the banks. And so it's a testament to the work there. So great. So Commissioner Pham, let me come to you. So your job is also to worry. In some cases, not as much as Sandra, but stuff. What worries you? What keeps you up at night?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of things that one can worry about. I'll reflect on what used to keep me up at night when I was in my previous role in the private sector, and then what keeps me up at night now. Similar, but slightly different because of the different seats that I've been in. So among the various roles I had at my last firm, which was Citigroup, one of the roles I had that was, I think, very influential in the shaping of my career was as the global head of swap dealer and Volcker compliance. And this was a role that I stepped into right as I joined the firm, and I'd never been in compliance before. I thought, well, aren't those the ones that go to jail? I don't know if I want to do this job. And It was exactly like Sandra said about the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. So at any given point, somewhere in the world, 24/7, something is breaking. How do I identify what is breaking, and how do I address it, and then how do I assess if there's some type of regulatory violation or some kind of harm or something like that? And it all comes down to having robust risk and control frameworks, risk governance and control frameworks. And so how do you have a systematic way to have policies and procedures, monitoring, testing, assessment, and so on and so forth? And it's similar to what my role is now as a commissioner when I think about our regulatory framework. Does our regulatory framework create that paradigm to view everything through so that we can ensure that each of our registrants indeed has a robust governance, risk, and control framework in order to address the risks that they face? But besides doing that, I also just get to think about what could be the end of the financial system as we know it. And in fact, each of us has lived through the different crises in our lives. For me, the savings and loan crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and then the COVID-19 pandemic. But it also became, for me, a subject of my work, both academic as well as professional. So in taking all of that together, and in particular in thinking through the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, one is that an imagination is a good asset to have actually as a regulator. You must be imaginative and creative to think about how do you look around corners, how do you do that horizon scanning that's necessary. And then the second aspect is probably for the CFTC in particular, when I think about what is the CFTC's role amongst all of the authorities in the world, we're not a member of FSB, but the members of FSB.
So what's FSB?
The Financial Stability Board. And Commissioner Uyeda, who actually the SEC is a member of the Financial Stability Board, and of course Sandra does a lot of coordination with that. He'll be able to tell you more about it because we're not allowed to be a member. The US can only have 3 members, and we're not one of them.
Is that because of George Washington, or is that?
That's a good question to ask. I think we'll have to put that on the follow-up. But at any rate, so there are plenty of regulators around the world that supervise and monitor the activities of financial institutions, particularly global systemically important banks, for example, and FSOC has a great role in particular around that. But for the CFTC, uniquely speaking, even though we have a global jurisdiction that's probably only second, maybe, to the Department of Justice when we think about our enforcement authority over fraud, abuse, or manipulation in any market where it can enter the stream of commerce. So that's the global commodity markets, for example. But we also directly oversee pretty much, I think, all of the GSIBs who are registered with us, both US and non-US, as swap dealers, and also what's known as systemically important financial market utilities. That includes clearinghouses for the most part. So we have been, and we still are, the primary regulator of the largest clearinghouses in the world. And so we're a clearinghouse to fail. That would have a cascading effect that would be like a triple black swan event for the financial system. And that's why one of the key aspects of the Dodd-Frank regulatory reforms and the G20 derivatives regulatory reforms was to ensure the resiliency of clearinghouses and to ensure that there was robust oversight. That's primarily done through, there's so many acronyms, the Committee for Payment and Markets Infrastructure, together with the International Organization of Securities Commission, and that CPMI is in itself a subset of the Bank for International Settlements, but there's the principles for financial market infrastructures, and all jurisdictions that are part of the largest and most significant economies are required to implement that, and that ensures the safety of clearinghouses and other financial market infrastructures.
Yeah, so as an example of a very large clearinghouse, we just, for those of you here with Terry Duffy from CME Group, has one of the largest clearinghouses there, and they have a lot of efficiencies in the system, but we worry about them melting down, so that's great. So Commissioner Uyeda, same question, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think it's a lot what Sandra said. It is resiliency. We don't know where the next threat or uncertainty is going to come from, but we need the ability to respond appropriately, or more importantly, not from a regulatory side, but for all the market participants out there. One thing that we have a constant debate over on, for instance, on financial stability is mutual funds and ETFs and liquidity requirements. What we don't want, for instance, is when we have volatile markets, is to have rules and regulations that inhibit countercyclical activity. So, for instance, we have a sudden sharp movement in bond prices. There may be many fund managers out there who are very familiar with their shareholders. They may know they are a lot in 401k retirement funds. They're going to be relatively what they call sticky assets, meaning they're not going to redeem. As bond prices drop, they look at that and they say, this pricing is attractive. But if we artificially restrain them from saying, no, you need to hold X amount in high quality liquid assets, for instance, and we have that more or less a rather arbitrary threshold that has to be set at some point, we may, in fact, exacerbate a situation where natural market forces would say, oh, let's start buying in, and that buying in starts to reverse the volatility of that market. So well-intentioned regulations, but don't allow the appropriate use of judgment, especially thinking about what may be particular to its circumstance, and sometimes we prevent beneficial activity from taking place.
Yeah, unintended consequences from regulation, where so it's the regulation actually causes the things that actually can happen, right? So,
or at least maybe not so much cause, but it really inhibits the ability of natural market forces to self-correct what has occurred.
Yeah, no, that's a great example of one, and that was one that came out when we were both at the commission together. Can you I'm going to go off script here a little bit. Can you talk about the importance of, and that one was actually, it was a regulated entity. It wasn't a bunch of people looking at data. It wasn't us thinking about it. It was somebody brought this to our, can you talk about the importance of public engagement into the regulatory process?
Oh, I think it's very important. One of the, especially, we have very strict conflicts of interest rules, which I think are very important. One has to have a certain amount of trust in the integrity of government, but that oftentimes means we don't have necessarily people who are as familiar with the industry, which means constant interaction, because things are always changing. How we looked at the markets 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I remember even going back to date myself, in the financial markets, when I first started practicing law as a corporate lawyer, there were questions as to whether or not a fax signature could bind a contract. Right now, we are well beyond that. It's up to us to figure out how we're doing things. We've got a project right now that's out for open comment on how people file with us. It's called EDGAR, which stands for Electronic Data Gathering and Retrieval System. Large parts of the system have not been upgraded since the architectural since the 1990s. We've kind of built other things on top of it. So it's, hey, we need to think about how people are interacting with this. And we finally did, I think, actually, while you were commissioner, we at least changed some of the things to no longer mandate, or at least have ASCII filings in there. You could do PDF and HTML. But that took a while for it to happen. So
only the old people are laughing at that joke, right? So for those of us who use MS-DOS, that's literally the system it was built on in the 90s. Was let's take paper-based prospectus delivery requirements and use ASCII text files. Right?
Well, don't even get me started on the 13F filings that we had. That's where institutional investment managers need to file their positions with us on a quarterly basis. We specifically told them to truncate the last 3 digits, and the reason was because ASCII can only go 144 characters wide, and so in order to have all the information on that form, it was like, all right, let's not include that. Now, for the longest time, until we changed that several years ago, we had so many filings because people would actually put the exact dollar amount. If they held a $2 billion position, they would show not 2 million, but 2 billion, which shows up as 2 trillion in the system. So, it is really important to have that engagement, so we make sure that at least we as a regulator do what we can to stay on top of technological changes.
Yeah, Commissioner Pham, so one of the ways the CFTC does engagement is, and the SEC does too, is through advisory committees. And you're the chair of one of the advisory committees. Can you talk about the importance of the industry serving on those committees and how it helps you in your role?
So the federal government has recognized the vast expertise and resources of the public, whether it's the industry, academic institutions, think tanks, and public interest groups. And so just over 50 years ago, the Federal Advisory Committee Act was passed, and it ensured that there was a mandated with the appropriate guardrails and things to address conflicts and so on and so forth, but an appropriate mechanism for the public to engage with the federal government and to provide input into the policy-making process. So at the CFTC, we have had a long-standing tradition where each one of the commissioners has the privilege of sponsoring one of these advisory committees. And so I've been very pleased to be the sponsor of the Global Markets Advisory Committee, near and dear to my heart since I started off supporting the global markets business when I was at Citi. And I was pleased to be able to relaunch it under my sponsorship. And I really wanted it to be focused on ensuring that there was a level playing field for global businesses and global markets. Because when I think about the core values of my commissionership and how I wanted to approach my role, it was really to make sure that we were promoting growth, progress, and access to markets in our various policy initiatives. And so the GMAC, as it's known, consists of, has 3 subcommittees, and those subcommittees are the Global Market Structure Subcommittee, the Digital Asset Markets Subcommittee, and the Technical Issues Subcommittee, which is as dry as it sounds. It's typically market infrastructure, technology, and operations issues, the pipes and plumbing of the financial markets. And I've been especially proud that under my sponsorship, we not only have over 125 members across all 3 subcommittees and the parent GMAC, which is the largest advisory committee initiative the CFTC has ever undertaken, but we've also issued 13 recommendations to date, and those span truly the breadth of the global markets, because you can have a derivative on any underlying asset class. So we have looked at issues like Treasury market structure reform, repo and funding markets, market volatility controls for commodity markets, T+1 security settlement and the impact with FX markets, swap data reporting to identify systemic risk, and a whole lot of other things that I'm forgetting. Oh, including the digital asset market, or digital asset taxonomy, which I know is coming up later. So it's been a terrific initiative, and I want to thank all of the firms and organizations that contribute their time and resources and a lot of hard work into these advisory committees.
Yeah, great, thanks. So Sandra, right, so obviously the FSOC benefits from all of the public engagement for each of the individual agencies themselves, and that sort of bubbles up. Do you, at the staff at Treasury, do you also engage with the public, and how so?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would echo the comments that were just shared about the importance of public and stakeholder engagement and having that constant sort of line in to get a sense of, sometimes, the regulators, government agencies, you can get, it's important to get the outside perspective. And so I would say that over the past few years in my role at the FSOC, and I know my Treasury colleagues feel the same, have worked really hard to engage with private sector and other public sector participants. So again, echoing what Mark and Carolyn just said. More specifically, I would say recently we hosted, I know we're going to talk maybe a little bit about AI, but we recently hosted a conference on AI and financial stability. And our specific goal, we partner with Brookings, is to bring in more diverse voices to think about, again, sort of some of the opportunities, benefits, and some other risks that we should be thinking about. And just another side note, Carolyn mentioned an external advisory committee. The FSOC actually created its first external advisory committee a couple of years ago, focused on climate-related financial risk. Again, to get those outside perspectives for us to think about.
Yeah, so Sandra, so you mentioned AI. I was going to go there next, right? So artificial intelligence topic in a lot of the panels we had today, keeping in line with the conference, a lot of innovation going there, but a lot of uncertainty and risks as the regulators are trying to wrap their arms around like what is possible here, what could go good, what could go wrong, all those sorts of stuff. You mentioned the partnering with Brookings on that. So tell us a little about how is the FSOC thinking about AI, and were there any specific learnings from that event?
Yeah, so I would say at a high level, again, frankly, just personally speaking, I mean, AI is really exciting, obviously, just to see how much efficiency one can gain. You have like immediate access to a tremendous amount of knowledge, again, that we never really had before. So again, I think there's tremendous opportunity and benefit there for sure. You know, on the FSOC side, again, thinking about sort of the benefits and risks, in our annual report last December, the FSOC did identify increased use of AI in financial services as something that warrants increased monitoring. So it's one of the 14 kind of vulnerabilities that we identified in our report. And you know what the FSOC said is, again, need to be very thoughtful about benefits, but kind of think about, you know, associated risk management themes that we should be monitoring for. So thinking about model risk, consumer compliance risk, cyber risk is a big one in the AI space. And so, you know, the council talks a bit about that in the report. And also mentioned the need for increased expertise building and capacity building on the part of market participants as well at the regulatory agencies. With respect to the conference, it was really great, Mike, to hear, again, those outside perspectives. And one thing that was kind of heartening to hear from the private sector is they are, you know, at least the folks that we were talking to at the conference, being very thoughtful about balancing, again, you know, risks and benefits. And they were talking about the need for good governance, better data, being thoughtful about model risk management in the AI space, as well as the need for good testing.
Yeah, great. So before I ask our market regulators about how they're thinking about balancing the risks and opportunities, in a few minutes we'll have the opportunity for students to ask questions. I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for that. So feel free to start lining up so that we know that we have questions. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. I have 100 other questions here, so ready to go. So Commissioner Pham, how do you think about balancing the risks and opportunities with AI?
With any activity, any business activity, there's always opportunities and risks. And I always like to say that risk management is at the core of any business, because if you're a business that's not very good at managing its risks, you're not going to be a business very long. And it's true with AI. AI is a tool. It's a technological development. It can help to augment you know, human capabilities and abilities. And Gen AI in particular has some very interesting implications for knowledge workers and for the services industry. So when I think about balancing the risks and opportunities in AI, honestly, I come back to the fact that most regulation ought to be technology neutral. There is no way for regulators to look into a crystal ball and to be able to anticipate every single technological development that may come down the road, nor should we. And I think when we think about the US legal system, there's precedent for that. I think back to what I learned in law school, not at Georgetown, which was that when the internet was first being regulated, they looked to some federal laws that we had that actually governed the use of telephones and telegraph. And I think that shows how through interpretation and through our regulatory approach, we are able to accommodate developments. So the CFTC has a principles-based regulatory framework that is technology neutral, and I think that's better. I think that allows us to be more nimble. It allows us to better anticipate and adapt to new and emerging risks, and then to take the appropriate, whether it may be to do public engagement, to do surveys, to do industry roundtables, to collect data, or to do studies. I think all of that are important tools that go into good policy making.
All right. Commissioner Uyeda?
Yeah, as Caroline said, these are tools, and we have dealt with constant technological change. You know, I was just at an event earlier today where we were talking about the 90 years of history. It's 90 years since the founding of the SEC. One constant has been how technology has changed all that entire time. So we've got artificial intelligence tools now out. There are a wide variety of them, but that still doesn't eliminate or does nothing, in my view, affects at all, for instance, our prohibition against fraud. You cannot use artificial intelligence tools to commit market manipulation. Can't use it to engage in insider trading. Can't use it for a lot of other things. Now, it does raise some interesting questions about the ability to scour ever more amounts of data. And I think when I think about the vast amounts that we are currently asking, whether it's on the regulated entity side or from public companies, and just what is out there, it's kind of interesting when you hear stories about, certain executive officers of large public companies, people are tracking maybe the Instagram or other social media feeds of people very close in their orbit, because maybe that indicates where they might be. And if all of a sudden they're in Omaha, Nebraska on a private jet, maybe that signals something, for instance. So it'll be interesting to see how these tools develop, but it's, at least from my perspective, not a problem that we haven't dealt with before. I think you do worry about situations, hey, are there ways that somehow this can just completely spiral out of control? But that's what we have FSOC for.
That's what, she can worry about that. Yeah.
And I wanted to provide 2 examples of what happens when you don't take a technology neutral approach. So the CFTC, up until a couple years ago, had specific record-keeping regulations for punch cards and microfiche. I would be very curious to see how many people in this room actually know what punch cards are or microfiche. Yes.
Yeah, not many.
Yes. Mike's contemporaries. So.
Yeah.
I got you back.
Touché.
I got you back. So punch cards are what giant supercomputers used to run off of, that I went to and visited at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory when I was a child. Anyway, so the CFTC had to go and had to update its regulations throughout all the different places where punch cards and microfiche and a lot of other outdated forms of communications or writings or records existed. So that's, I think, a very specific and concrete example about if we just generally talked about records and then had sort of an expansive concept of what a record is. It could include, for example, today, digital tokens in the blockchain. So we wouldn't have to go back and redo all of our regulations. And as all of you have probably noticed, the legislative and rulemaking process is lengthy and laborious. It's not fast.
Oh, my freshman year at Georgetown, I had to register classes with punch cards.
Wow. You are old. All right, questions from the audience, in particular students. Want to ask? Yeah, sure, right over here.
Hey there, thank you for your time and for visiting. I'm a current MBA student. I had a question. In an age where obviously we're seeing some reduction perhaps in agency independence through various court decisions, how do you think about crafting regulatory frameworks with emerging technologies and new things that might be coming without maybe some of the independence that was there previously? And maybe more importantly, how do you talk to legislators about how they should be crafting statutes to give the kind of flexibility that you all might need as things change without needing to go through that very laborious rulemaking process?
I would love to just quickly answer that question with my microfiche and punch card example. So under the new Supreme Court precedent, the ability for an agency such as mine to decide that Congress's intention was for us to generally capture records, and of course there's technological development and innovation, and so anyhow punch cards could be some type of physical record, and maybe, microfiche is something else. There could be some room for agency interpretation, perhaps. But now, of course, if you look at a strict statutory interpretation, it means what it means, microfiche and punch cards. And so that's one impact, for example.
Mark?
Yeah, I think it doesn't change things a whole lot in the sense that as an independent federal regulator, what exactly do you mean by independent? Well, we've always been subject to Congress. That's the way our Constitution's set up. Article 1, the legislative branch. We've always been subject to judicial review of one way. And there was a judicial doctrine, Chevron, that was out there, which at least at one point would say that if the law was ambiguous, then the courts should defer to the interpretation of the administrative agency. We have always, in all of our rulemaking, both when Chevron was in effect and now I anticipate going forward afterwards, we need to describe what is our statutory authority, because ultimately that is our foundation. Congress has to authorize us to do something. So do we have the statutory authorization? And are we acting in a rational manner, meaning, or in legal speak, not being arbitrary and capricious, which means we need to explain what we're doing and why we're doing, which, in my view, that regardless of what the Supreme Court decisions expressly say, that's just, I think, a matter of good government. When the government takes actions, we're acting with the full authority, weight, and power of the sovereign, so to speak. So we ought to be able to articulate what we're doing and why we're doing that. And as what the decision over Bright said, the courts should be looking at that reasoning. And if it makes sense to them as a reasonable exercise of our authority, then to uphold that under what's called Skidmore review.
And when you think about all of the cases in administrative law, and particularly the Administrative Procedure Act against both of our agencies, where the agencies tend to lose on the arbitrary and capricious violation is because we have failed to show our work, as Commissioner Uyeda has just explained. And so everybody in this room, particularly the current students, should know that you have to be able to show your work. And if you cannot, then why should somebody believe or defer to what you have come up with?
Yeah, so show your work in the real world and in the classroom. Excellent. So I think we got time for one more question.
I was wondering if any of you guys could share what made you decide to pursue careers in financial regulatory policy, especially to us as students.
Sandra, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. Happy to start. I'm also a lawyer. I was in private practice. And after private practice, I started work in the legal department at the New York Fed. And I started actually in March of 2008, just right after Bear went under.
So you caused it.
Yeah, no. But it was, for me, a searing experience to be at a central bank during a time, so Bear was that March. The global financial crisis occurred that fall, obviously. And for me, it was a searing experience to see. It was really scary, to be honest, in that fall in 2008, 2009. And it really informed my personal, I guess, commitment to financial stability and wanted to be in public service to prevent, in some ways, the next crisis. And in some ways, that's kind of why I think I'm sitting in the seat at the FSOC.
Right. So Caroline and Mark, fairly quickly, we're almost out of time.
Right? So it's because I wanted to figure out some way that I could help and contribute. My parents were airlifted from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on the last day of the Vietnam War. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this great country, so I wanted to give back. After 9/11, I actually signed up for Army ROTC, but that was not the best way for me to give back. And in the financial crisis, although I am pretty, well, anyway. And during the financial crisis, I was going to school during the financial crisis, and I thought it was very interesting. I thought this was a way that I could jump in and I could contribute and I could give back, and I hope that I've been able to succeed.
Excellent. Mark?
Well, I took my Georgetown finance degree and went to law school, much to the chagrin of my finance professors at the time. But I became a corporate lawyer doing a lot of transactions and deals, and a lot of times I would say, well, this regulatory provision makes no sense. Clients don't pay you to figure out what the solution ought to be. It's just, hey, comply with the law, don't get me into trouble. At that point, I realized if you want to change the law, you got to go into financial policy. And that's when I opted to go into public service.
Excellent. We are out of time. Sandra, Caroline, Mark, thank you so much.